Welcome back to the channel, everybody. In the numerous social media groups I'm in where we talk about JMRI, I have noticed that there are a lot of people who ask questions about how or if you can do intermodal trains and well cars in JMRI. So I thought to myself, you know what? Let's make a simulation, let's explore the idea, and talk about some ways you can do just that. So stay tuned. All right, well, let's first briefly talk about two real-life examples. So this is the CPKC intermodal terminal in Wiley, Texas. So this has several intermodal trains that run originate and terminate here, and they run to the east. So these are the ones that get on the Meridian Speedway. So this is a intermodal terminal where all trains coming in stop here. The entire train stops here. And any trains that leave here that are specifically intermodal, they completely are built here. So we don't have any, small amounts of intermodal cars coming in from other intermodal trains, and we don't have an intermodal train that comes in and just cuts off parts of its train. So we've got entire trains originate and terminate right here. This next one is the intermodal terminal for the CPKC in Jackson, Mississippi. And this is on the Meridian Speedway. This terminal is far smaller. It only has 2 tracks. And this terminal is exclusively for setting out small cuts of intermodal cars from a fully built intermodal train. So we don't terminate entire intermodal trains here. We do only terminate portions. So a few cars, and then we'll pick up a few cars here and there. So you might drop off, 2 or 3 well car sets here and pick up a couple. But not that I work for CPKC, because I don't, but based off kind of just some observations, some videos I've watched of the operations here and in Wiley, and some people I've talked to who do work for CPKC, that seems to be the process. So we're going to go with the assumption that in Jackson, we do not terminate entire trains, but in Wiley, we do. And so the reason that helps us is because when we look at these two intermodal facilities, they are quite different. So the one that I'm going to show you first, I've roughly created one major simulation. Then we're going to kind of talk a little bit about a second simulation. But the big simulation is kind of like Wiley. So we've got arrival tracks here. We've got some tracks where we load and unload the containers themselves. And then we've got what you could consider either loop tracks or departure tracks up here. This is a yard for like general freight that they put sometimes on these trains, or that they run over into either Shreveport or all the way out to Artesia, even Mississippi, for the Artesia sub. So, but let's assume that these are the arrival tracks, these are the loading tracks, and these are the departure tracks. So the simulation that I've created is going to do just that. But the intermodal terminal that I have modeled is one that's more like Jackson, in that we're only ever going to set out just a few bits and pieces. We're never going to terminate a full train. I will discuss about how you can set up both, but the simulation that I'm going to show you here in just a second is more like Jackson in the regard of the fact that we don't terminate full trains. All right, so jumping into JMRI, let's talk about what we have. We've got our intermodal yard that we've made here, and basically we've made 2 trains, one that goes east, one that goes west. They just go from staging to the intermodal yard and then to the opposite staging, and of course one goes the other direction. So the intermodal yard itself, if we look at that, it's got 3 spurs. These are the load tracks. They're about 1,500 feet each. And then currently they're only accepting 3 different types of well cars I'm going to talk about in just a minute, as well as the switcher, because I've set up a train here that does the switching for us via a switch list. So I'll show that in just a minute as well. Yard tracks, we have 2 engine service tracks where you can set off engines or locomotives from trains that terminate or originate here. And then we have 4 classification interchange tracks. So we have 2 arrival tracks and 2 departure tracks. And if I go click on edit and I'll show you what this looks like, we have some limitations on setouts. So for the arrival tracks, only the intermodal trains themselves can set out here, and only the switcher can pick up. And then, of course, the opposite is true for the departure tracks. So this is if I want to have a dedicated switcher job that works the intermodal yard. Now, you don't have to do it that way. In fact, it's probably easier not to, and I will talk about that, at the end. But for now, let's move over and talk about the car types. So, what I have designed here, let's get these organized. There we go. I have created 3 car types. So I have a well car 5 set, a well car 3 set, and a well car 1 set. So this is just, one individual well car. A 3 set is 3 well cars that are articulated and put together. That's why they're 200 feet instead of 62. And then we have 324 for the well car 5 set. So 5 well cars put together, articulated set. So you can see I've added quite a bit of each of these. Some of them are sitting on different trains. Some of them are not sitting on current trains. And then we've actually, all of them are currently sitting on a train. That's nice, my bad. But we do have some that are in a kernel. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. All right, so kind of the idea here is we've got a few sitting in the intermodal yard. We've got a few sitting on the trains that are going to the intermodal yard. And this intermodal yard is one where we are going to set out a few cars and pick up a few cars. So let's jump over and talk about the switch lists. All right, so here is our switch list for the westbound intermodal. I didn't go into any real detail about the cars. I just populated it with some cars, so that's why their numbers are repetitive. That's why their reporting marks are repetitive. All right, not worried about that right now. But you see we have some 5 sets, we have some 3 sets, and some 1 sets. I am not currently using schedules. I'm using default loads and empties. So notice we are working at east staging. We're picking up our train there. And then we're heading over to the intermodal yard where we have 4 pickups and 4 set outs. All right, so we've got actually quite a bit of our train we're going to be setting out here, and quite a bit more we'll be picking up. So very nice setup there. I do have randomization on where it can randomize up to 100%. So I see this time it didn't randomize at all, and that's fine. Our train length is 2,000 feet, so we are right beneath that as we depart. And of course, we head over to west staging. So this is a train that does not set out all of its train, but it does set out part of it. So you see we're setting out a couple of 5 sets and a 3 set, and then we're picking up 4 of the 5 sets. So we still have quite a few other cars get left on the train. Now, the switcher I have set where it will move some cars from arrival 1 to departure 1, and from arrival 1 to load 1, and then from load to load 2, and load 2 to load 3. So I kept this because this represents a problem. If you want to have a dedicated switcher at any industry, if you go back and watch my video last time about modeling large industries, I recommended using a schedule. The same is true here. I would absolutely recommend that if you want to model this correctly, you want to use a schedule. So we would have a schedule set up where a train would come into the arrival track. It would get picked up on the arrival track, and then it would head over to either the load or actually any of the load tracks. And the schedule would tell us that from the load tracks, they only can go to the departure tracks. And we would make sure that our departure tracks can't receive any cars from the arrival track. You don't want to bring a car in and then just skip it over to a departure track without putting it on a load track. That would just be changing its train. I know that does happen, and some cars aren't necessarily loaded or unloaded at a terminal. But, this terminal we're modeling, remember, we're talking about Jackson here as an example. It's not necessarily huge, and so we're not trying to just shuffle cars around. I think they do some of that in Shreveport at Doremus Yard. I'm not certain on that, but that's the idea I get behind the intermodal operations for KCS or CPKC. But that shows a restriction there that you'd want to adjust, and that is have a schedule. Now, our eastbound intermodal, I've set this up into a kernel. So that means all of these cars are stuck together as a unit. So they're only going to move as one unit. And that's why they don't get set out here, because there's not enough space for all of them on the same track. And I did that on purpose because we're going to talk a little bit more detail in a minute about how you can get entire unit trains to terminate in your intermodal yard if you would like to. But it is definitely a different setup than what we have here with the westbound train. So one last thing I'll say on this, I would personally recommend using a schedule. That'll help fix some of the problems we're seeing here where it's just kind of shuffling cars around randomly. I would also recommend that you actually don't use a switcher personally. I would recommend actually going into your trains on JMRI, or your routes rather, and having your trains themselves or the routes set out directly to individual tracks. Actually, let me do that via the routes. So what I would recommend personally is, for example, if I look at the westbound. All right, here is the route for the westbound. I would tell you to have it do its setouts here in the intermodal yard, which would be fine. But what we're going to do is we're not going to have the route that has the switcher. And so I would tell you to actually do away with the with the arrival and departure tracks all together, like don't even have those there, and instead just have the spurs that it sets out to. And then what it'll do is your switch list will tell you, hey, set out all these cars to these different spurs. And then you can just, use that as you run the switcher. That actually makes the programming a lot easier. It makes it where you don't have to program a route. You don't have to program another train or build a third switch list. Plus also it gives you the flexibility where you technically could get better operations without having to use a schedule, actually, because you would only be setting out cars to a spur. And then from the spur, it would, you would move it over to the departure track. Even though JMRI wouldn't tell you that, that is an operation you could still mimic. So that would be my recommendation there, actually, is to not use the switcher. I just wanted to use it to kind of show you how that would be set up. Now, let's talk about kernels. So when we move back over to cars, and we talk about cars, notice that these guys have a kernel, so they stay together. So all of these guys are together. So if I do one car move and it's on one, it picks this car, it'll pick all of these cars and it'll move them together. And all these together make one train. So notice they're all the cars on the eastbound intermodal. So if I have enough space in a spur for them to go to, it'll set out the entire train on that spur and it will either load them or empty them, which is fantastic. And then when you pick it up from there, it can get on the next train and keep on going. So if you want to run a train from staging to the intermodal yard and terminate it, then you want to use a kernel, because that will make sure that you get the whole train to terminate at once. If there's not enough space, it just won't build for you. It'll give you a build error. The other option, which I don't necessarily recommend, but it does exist, is to go into your intermodal yard and make it like add a staging only track, where you're basically running from staging to staging, but the staging that you terminate at is in the intermodal yard. So we would have like another location here called intermodal staging yard or something. And it would be in the same physical location as this one, but in JMRI, it'd be listed as staging, and that would also make sure that it terminates the entire train. I personally wouldn't do that, because if I'm going to model an intermodal yard, I want the train to come in. I want the locomotives actually to come off of the train, and I want them to move over onto like some engine storage tracks or some service tracks or something like that while, we use the local crew to work the yard. That's kind of how I would like to have it done. So anyways, I think I'm going to make sure I've got everything covered, but I think for the most part, that is pretty much it. So thank you guys for joining. Stay tuned for more videos. I do definitely enjoy talking about these JMRI specific kind of videos to help with some niche ideas, but definitely with containers and intermodal trains, there is actually quite a bit you can model in JMRI to facilitate those kind of movements, especially if you want to do more than just unit trains. But you can still do unit trains. But anyways, hope this was helpful. Leave a comment if you have some questions, and I will catch you guys next time. Thanks again.